The agreement is with the United States. It is a one-off agreement. It will not be repeated. It is only available to those currently in the regional processing centres. It will not be available to any persons who seek to reach Australia in the future.
As of yet, it's an undefined number. But according to Malcolm Turnbull, a substantial one. Those eligible to be resettled in the U.S. are among the 1,800 people being held in Nauru and Papua New Guinea in what human rights groups say are deplorable conditions.
And we have met people who were deeply damaged by the length of the detention. Self-harm, PTSD, anxiety, depression. The fact that this policy is mandatory, to me, is a violation of international human rights law.
After 15 years, it's clear that Australia's approach to screen asylum seekers intercepted at sea, dubbed the Pacific Solution, has instead become a problem. Now, a solution to the solution is in the works, but under pressure with a change of power in the United States less than 2 months away. U.S. President-elect Donald Trump has been vocal about his anti-immigrant views, especially with regard to Muslim asylum seekers.
The time is overdue to develop a new screening test for the threats we face today. I call it extreme vetting.
Australian officials believe the transfers won't be completed until after U.S. President Barack Obama leaves office. Turnbull had announced in September that Australia would take refugees from Central America, being held in U.S. facilities as part of its annual intake of 18,750 people. Even with a new American solution for Australia's refugee problem, many of the conflicts driving millions from their homes are only getting worse, as Western governments plan to erect more walls to keep those seeking asylum out. Randolph Nogle, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now is Anthony Lowenstein, an independent journalist, usually based in Australia, but joining me today from Jerusalem. Thanks for joining us once again, Anthony. Looking at the details of this swap deal, if you like, between Australia and the United States, there seems to be a bit of a subtext here. Am I reading incorrectly into it that it seems to be a Muslims for Christians, Christians for Muslims sort of deal between the two?
That's definitely one way to see it. I think the context of your report, they made it very clear. Australia has had a very, very hardline policy for about 20 years, and sadly, in the last few years, Australia seems to be inspiring many other countries around the world, especially in Europe, how to manage refugees, put them in privatised detention centres and lock and almost throw away the key. The latest deal between Australia and the US is really lacking in pretty much any detail. How many people are going to go? Why are they going to go? Where are they going to go? And also, more importantly, why can't the refugees come to Australia? These people have been on Manus Island and Nauru for over 3 years. There are allegations with huge amounts of evidence of rape. There's been murders, there's been sexual assaults, there's been massive mental breakdown. Australia, in both major parties, have refused to bring these people to Australia under some kind of guise of deterrence. But here we are years on, and a supposed deal between the US and Australia, which may well not happen when Donald Trump becomes president very shortly, really puts the whole thing in question.
I want to pick up on what you said with regards to both parties. Prime Minister Turnbull's government seems to be popular when it comes to this decision in many ways. Polls showed that while the majority did want these people to be resettled, they didn't want them on those islands in the inhumane conditions, but crucially, they didn't want them in Australia. So, as an Australian, tell me what's going on there.
Look, there's no question that in the last decades, like I would say what's happening in other Western countries, parts of Europe, the US, the UK, refugees have been demonised so successfully, especially since 9/11 as well, and particularly Muslims, of course, that there's almost a sense that refugees who are arriving are potentially a threat. I should make it clear, though, there's been no example of any refugee who's arrived in Australia who has committed a terrorist act, by boat, I should say. And there's a strange, weird psyche in Australia that says that if you arrive as a refugee or you arrive from overseas by plane, you are not a threat. If you arrive by boat, which normally means from Indonesia, you are potentially dangerous. And we shouldn't forget, people who are coming to Australia, who have come to Australia in the past as well, who are mostly on Manus Island and Nauru, are from countries who have every right to flee: Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Myanmar, many Rohingya as well. So the truth is, these people who, I might add, in every evidence shows 90% of whom are found to be legitimate refugees, are sadly in the Australian community, both, not entirely, but there's a lot of people who both fear them, who don't want them there, and in fact that's also being whipped up by many elements in the Murdoch press. Australia has the most tightly concentrated print press in the Western world. Rupert Murdoch owns 70% of the print media, and that's created a really ugly atmosphere, which is why, as I said, Australia now seems to be inspiring other countries in its draconian policy.
There's been a lot of criticism of Australia from the UN Special Rapporteur on Migrant Human Rights, Francois Crepeau, from Anna Neistat from Amnesty International. They were calling the conditions on the islands inhumane, and so on. Does any of that move the dial in any way and empower those who are against the government's policies right now?
I wish the answer to that question was yes. There's no doubt there's been countless reports for years, the ones you cite, many, many others, that have shown the conditions not just offshore on Manus and Nauru, but also on the Australian mainland. I've spent a lot of time in the last 5 years spending time in a lot of those facilities, obviously as a visitor, as a journalist. The conditions there are appalling. They're far worse offshore. And we should also say, journalists have no ability to get onto those offshore facilities. They are essentially black sites. And many human rights groups have called those facilities black sites. They are akin to a Guantanamo Bay. People are locked up there indefinitely. You ask, is the dial shifting? Look, in some circles, to be sure, yes. But I think there is a very, very strong mood at the moment, which we see across Europe, the UK, obviously US voting for Trump recently, and very much in Australia as well, which doesn't just demonise refugees, which somehow views immigration from certain countries as a potential threat. Now, Australia has obviously issues with a tiny minority of people who are attracted to, say, ISIS. That's a fact, sure. But the idea somehow there should be a connection made between someone arriving by boat from, say, Iraq or Afghanistan, who's therefore going to carry out a terrorist attack. It's never happened in Australia, ever. And I think there's very much a need for a lot of Australians to realise that the community contribution of refugees from Vietnam years ago, from various other countries, Lebanon, much of the Middle East and elsewhere, has been uniformly positive with a very few occasional issues, like in any country. So Australia is multicultural, but has increasing issues with that identity, and we see that similarly across the Western world at the moment.
Anthony, unfortunately we are out of time. Good to talk to you once again. Anthony Lowenstein joining us there from Jerusalem.